All right, class, we're still on section 1.7, which deals with extrema and average rate of change. So I want to look at trying to estimate and identify extrema of a function. So the points at which a function changes its increasing or decreasing behavior are seen as peaks or valleys on its graph. At these critical points, called extrema, the function has maximum or minimum values, either relative or absolute. So let's first look at this idea of relatives, minimums and relative maximums. Relative minimums are the lowest point in a particular graph, or it's considered to be, I would consider it to be like valley points. Okay? And then relative maximums are considered to be peaks on my graph. So when I look at this graph, it looks like there are two minimums, and right now I would consider them to be relative mins. And then there are two maximum points, and I could say that they are relative maxes right now. So the next thing we want to look at is the idea of absolute minimums and absolute maxes. Absolute minimums are the lowest point in the entire graph, and absolute maximums are the highest points in the entire graph. So let's look at this graph right here. I know right now that there are 1, 2, 3 points. So right now, I would say that these are at least relative mins. But when I look at this point, that point looks like it is the lowest point on my entire graph. There are no y values that are lower than it. So I would consider this to be an absolute min. And then I would say these 2 points are maximums, relative maxes. Now when I look at this graph, there's only one minimum, but it's a relative min because there are lots of other y values that are smaller than it because it's going down. And there are two maxes. This is a relative max. But I would say this is an absolute max because this is the absolute highest point. So let's look at an example. I want to be able to classify and estimate the extrema for each graph. So when I look at this graph, there's 3 different changes of direction. 1, 2, 3. I would say that these are maxes, and this is a minimum. So let's look at x equals negative 1.5. Well, I'm looking at x values getting closer and closer to negative 1.5 because that's where it looks like that's a peak point. It's a high point. And when I look at those y values, they look like they're getting bigger and bigger. Now, when I go right after negative 1.5 to like negative 1.2, that looks like it's a 1.57. It's smaller than this. So it looks like at negative 1.5, 2.06, I have at least a relative max. I cannot figure out if I have an absolute max until after I look at this point. So let's look at this value right here, this x value. And we're going to say that x value is like negative 0.3. So when I go from negative 1 all the way to negative 0.3, I could see that my y values are getting smaller. Now when I go to the right of negative 0.3 to 0, 1, and 0.5, it looks like at negative 0.3 and negative 0.31, this is at least a relative min. And what I could say about this graph is there looks like there are y values because this is going down, and looks like the end behavior is going to negative infinity as x is getting bigger and as x is getting smaller. I know that will be a relative min. Let's look at this point right here and see, is that a relative max or is it the absolute max? So when I look at 1, where x equals 1, I know right now that this is a max at negative 1.5, and I know that this is a relative min. But when I look at negative 1, or a positive 1, as I get closer and closer to 1, it looks like the y values are getting bigger, but then when I go right after 1, it looks like my y values are getting smaller. So this is at 1 and 3, there is no other point higher than this point right here. So I would say at 1, 3, this is my absolute max. So when I look at this graph, I can say that at negative 1.5, 2.06, this is a relative max. At negative 0.3, negative 0.31, that's a relative min. And then at 1, 3, this is an absolute max. So what I wanted you guys to do is look at this graph right here and try to identify the relative min, relative max, absolute min, absolute max, and we'll go over it in class tomorrow.